It blacks out portions of the released documents, resists requests that the administration officials testify under oath, and tries to rush the Commission's deadline. After a cat-and-mouse game, Bush and Cheney meet the Commission. But it is behind closed doors. They refuse to testify under oath. No tape recorders are allowed. No transcript is allowed. Bush makes no opening statement, and those taking notes must submit them to security personnel. All of this is what is called in law guilty demeanor. The behavior of the White House in relation to the Commission from start to finish only makes sense if the official story is a lie and the truth needs to be kept secret. The term whitewash doesn't do justice to the report of the 9/11 Commission. Omission-riddled, inventive cover-up, maybe? The Commission finds that the ultimate reason the events of 9/11 took place was a failure of imagination. They ought to know. Imagination was something the Commission had in abundance. The Commission imagines U.S. intelligence received insufficient specific warnings of an impending event. Even though CIA head George Tenet says in an unguarded moment that the system was blinking red, the Commission imagines there's nothing to go with.
They hope you do not question the gag order placed upon firefighters who were at the scene and policemen who were at the scene. They hope you buy the asinine excuse that the gag order is for national security. Let's all come together as Americans and sign over the entire Constitution and the Bill of Rights so we can get these terrorists once and for all. What the hell? Why don't we just give our Constitution and Bill of Rights away to a country that can use them? Besides, when was the last time you remember the United States using them? As President Bush stated, "Stop throwing the Constitution in my face. It's just a goddamn piece of paper." Aside from the nearly 3,000 heroes that have given their lives at Ground Zero, the Pentagon and Shanksville, there are indeed more heroes that have descended from September 11, 2001. However, these heroes are presently being treated as communists or conspiracy theorists. These heroes are trying to persuade you to pull your heads out of the mainstream media long enough to simply look at the video evidence they have gathered through a form of media that the government has not been able to seize. These heroes are your own sons and your own daughters. I listened to my son and it turns out that it was the best thing I could do for my country. Please give your son or daughter 1 hour of your time. Please.
I'll say a word and you think of the first word that comes to mind. Conspiracy theory is what most people think of. We've all been conditioned to associate the word theory with the word conspiracy because after all, no conspiracies could possibly be true. They're all just theories, aren't they? Well, in the phrase conspiracy theory, there are two words. The first word, conspiracy. The second word is the active word, theory. By definition, a theory is a supposition, an idea, a concept, a hypothesis. Let me give you an example. In theory, if I purchase a raffle ticket, I could win a prize. Now, as long as I don't purchase a raffle ticket, my win is theoretical. But once you purchase a raffle ticket, the win is no longer a theory. It becomes a possibility. And the more raffle tickets you purchase, the more possible and eventually probable the win becomes. Such is the case with a conspiracy theory. As long as there is no evidence, it is a conspiracy theory. But once you have a piece of evidence, no matter how flimsy or circumstantial it may be, it becomes a possibility. And the more evidence that is gathered, the more possible and eventually probable the conspiracy is.
If the American empire is interpreted in different ways, the same is true, all the more so, for the term 9/11. For those Americans who accept the official interpretation, 9/11 was a surprise attack on the U.S. government and its people by Islamic terrorists. For some Americans, 9/11 has a more complex meaning. This second group, while accepting the official interpretation of the attacks, thinks of 9/11 primarily as an event that was used opportunistically by the Bush administration to extend the American empire. This interpretation is effectively presented by writers such as Noam Chomsky, Rahul Mahajan, and Chalmers Johnson. For a third group of Americans, the name 9/11 connotes an event with a more sinister dimension. These citizens believe that the Bush administration knew the attacks were coming and intentionally let them happen. Although no national poll has been taken to ascertain how many Americans in general hold this view, a Zogby poll in New York surprisingly indicated that almost half of the residents of New York City held that view. According to a fourth view of 9/11, the attacks were not merely foreknown by the Bush administration, they were orchestrated by it. Although thus far no poll has tried to find out how many Americans hold this view, polls in Canada and Germany taken some time back indicated that this view was already held by 15 to 20% of their people. Religious people who take the moral principles of their religious tradition seriously will probably have very different attitudes about the American empire depending on which of these four views they hold. If they accept the official view, according to which America was the innocent victim of evil terrorists, then it is easy for them to think of America's so-called war on terror as a just war. This was the position taken by Jean Bethke Elshtain, a professor of ethics at the University of Chicago's Divinity School, in a book called Just War Against Terror. From this perspective, the war on terror has nothing to do with imperial designs. It is simply a war to save the world from evil terrorists. Second interpretation of 9/11, according to which the Bush administration cynically exploited the 9/11 attacks to further its imperial plans, has quite different implications. Although it thinks of the attacks as surprise attacks, planned entirely by external enemies of America, it regards these attacks as blowback for injustices perpetrated by U.S. imperialism. This second view typically regards the American response to the attacks of 9/11 as far worse than the attacks themselves. They've already led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. This interpretation of 9/11 would lead people who take their religion's moral principles seriously to support a movement to change U.S. foreign policy. An even stronger reaction would be evoked by the third interpretation, for it entails that the Bush administration allowed thousands of its own citizens to be killed on 9/11, deliberately and cold-bloodedly, for the sake of advancing its imperial interests, and then used this event as an excuse to kill hundreds of thousands of people in other lands, while hypocritically portraying itself as promoting a culture of life. Of course, those who accept the previous interpretation know that hypocrisy with regard to the sanctity of life has long been a feature of official U.S. rhetoric. And yet most Americans, if they learned that their government had deliberately let their own citizens be killed, would surely consider this betrayal qualitatively different. For this would be treason, a betrayal of the oath taken by American political leaders to protect their own citizens. If this third view implies that the Bush administration is guilty of a heinous and even treasonous crime, this is all the more the case with the fourth view. For many Americans, the idea that we are living in a country whose own leaders planned and carried out the attacks of 9/11 is simply too horrible to entertain. Unfortunately, however, there is considerable evidence for this view.
I believe that crossing the Rubicon provides amply documented evidence with which to initiate and sustain a number of indictments of top-level government officials for their roles in facilitating the attacks of 9/11. Most notably, as my chief suspect, I name Vice President Richard Cheney as both a planner and executor of those attacks.